Hey, Detoxers. Welcome to another episode of the Disinfo Detox. Today, I am joined by journalist, author, and YouTuber Kevin Gosztola. Welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thank you.
Heck yeah, man. Thanks for joining me. I got a couple things I want to talk to you about today. I think, as you know, and certainly our audience knows, I've always been an admirer of your work all the way back to was it the Fire Dog Lake days?
Oh yeah, that's how I got my start, and just sort of like fell into following the whole WikiLeaks story from its origins and onward, and yeah,
Now you're with the Dissenter, correct?
yeah. This is a newsletter and mostly focus on freedom of the press, whistleblowing, and government secrecy. Just sort of carving out a kind of niche because a lot of times, well, it's different now that Donald Trump's president, but before that's not something that the we'll call it I like to call it the prestige media. That's not something that they would give any like a lot of repeated coverage, but now Trump is such a target that like it makes sense to follow those stories closely.
Absolutely. And you had an article from August 10th titled Israeli Military Assassinates Prominent Al Jazeera Journalists Prior to Invading Gaza City. And the article is it references the Israeli military force to what you say assassinated a journalist named Anas al-Sharif. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, of Al Jazeera. For folks who maybe haven't followed this story, can you tell folks a little bit about what happened here and why you thought the word assassination was appropriate for it?
Well, sure. So this is one of several Al Jazeera journalists now that have been killed by the Israeli military since they started. I'm going to use the word genocide, but the since they started the bombing campaign or ethnic cleansing operations that they've undertaken throughout all of Gaza. Clearly, they've been targeting these journalists because what we've seen is they'll go and release materials where they label a particular journalists that do have massive followings. And Anas al-Sharif was someone who did have quite a following on social media. People around the world were following his reports. And in particular, I draw attention to how just a few weeks ago, we were watching him describe in very emotional detail how he was starving while he was out there daily collecting the latest news related to this war on the people of Gaza. And so the Israeli government, and particularly through the military, had labeled Anas al Sharif as a Hamas cell leader, signaling him out, suggesting that he was involved in the military wing of Hamas. And so when this strike was carried out on Gaza City, it particularly went at this media tent. It didn't only kill Anas Sharif, it also killed four or five other colleagues. I mean, technically speaking, we should be saying they bombed and killed an entire Al Jazeera crew that was there in Gaza City, nearby the Al Shifa hospital, and that they were all essentially exterminated in that moment by this attack. And I believe that they knew what they were doing. I don't know if they knew they were going to kill all those other people, but I mean, they had obviously been tracking Anas Sharif. If we go back to last year, he was one of several individuals that was put into a fabricated dossier, which was called out by several press freedom groups as putting like the crosshairs on the back. And there's another journalist that was in that. There was a group of six, and in that group of six, one of them was Hassam Shabat, who was already killed by Israel several months ago, and he was a high-profile journalist as well. And so the press freedom organizations from around the world, some of the major media organizations have caught on to the fact that they are targeting journalists in this manner. But as we could get into how much they have failed those in their profession who are doing this hard work in Gaza. But I think the point needs to be emphasized here that the reason why they would go and assassinate him at this point is because, as I presented it and framed it, and I didn't just come up with the frame myself. I should credit people who are Palestinian journalists and others who are following the conflict closely. The way that they presented this incident is to say the Israeli government had already authorized a plan to invade and occupy Gaza City. It's going to be a massive takeover. They're going to be pushing hundreds of thousands of people out of this city. There's going to be lots of bloodshed and destruction. And they didn't want somebody like Anas al-Sharif there on the ground to report on it because he has been effective. And so that's why they targeted the media tent where he was located prior to invading Gaza City.
Okay, and of course, while this is going on in Israel, which is getting massive support from the United States, we've also entered the second Trump term here, and we've done a lot in this program to cover the ways in which Trump has used lawsuits and rhetorical attacks on press outlets to basically get them to, bend the knee to him and whatever narrative he wants, applying pressure where he can. And I want to talk to you about all of those developments. But I think you followed a story that now really looks like a canary in the coal mine, which is the case of Julian Assange. And when I say you followed it, and I want you to talk a little bit about this, I think a lot of people will think like, oh, that story was covered a lot. It was in the news a lot. But as you pointed out, when you were covering some of the hearings and other things, the press really kind of only jumped into this story at sensationalistic moments. They were not on a lot of the calls. But anyways, can you talk a little bit about how you kind of got into the Assange story and what it meant to follow the story and how it ultimately ended? And I should say that you wrote this all up in a great book called "Guilty of Journalism: The Political Case Against Julian Assange," a great book I've read. But can you talk a little bit about kind of your relationship with WikiLeaks and Assange as a journalist?
Yeah, thank you for that, Nolan. This was a book that was the culmination of 10 to 15 years of reporting that I had been able to do either at Firedog Lake, or I had a media organization, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Shadowproof. And we spent a lot of time documenting what was going on. In this case against Julian Assange was a culmination of a lot of what we had seen. You could go back to when President George W. Bush entered office, and in the final weeks that he was there, some of the crackdowns on journalism that came from reporters at uh, the more prominent media outlets actually covering the excesses of the administration, abuses of power. And then there were crackdowns that led after that. And then you had President Barack Obama come into power, and there was a incredible escalation by the Justice Department when it came to using the Espionage Act, weaponizing it against the press, going after sources to identify and then eventually prosecute and put them in jail. And you had more people prosecuted under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined when Obama was in office. Donald Trump was handed that machinery when he had his first term, and he also prosecuted a few people. And one of the people he indicted and chose to indict that Obama had chosen to pass on indicting was Julian Assange. And as you're saying, it's a canary in the coal mine. I think on one hand, we can connect it to the moment, to the present, just by the fact that Julian Assange, who is free now, and every day that I can say that, I'm ecstatic to know that he's no longer being held in high security prison in London, awaiting extradition to the United States. But we just saw in the last week or so that he was leading a march with his wife Stella in Australia against the destruction that is unfolding in Gaza, against the starvation that's being imposed collectively on all of these people. And when he was released, he actually went before a body in Europe. Unfortunately, I can't remember the specific body, but he went before this European body, and it was the first time that he spoke about his case since his release. And he was very clear that the thing that troubled him most now was that we were seeing the live streaming of massacres on almost a daily basis. Because if you recall anything about the WikiLeaks story, what catapulted them to prominence in 2010 was the publication of something known as the collateral murder video that showed an Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad in 2007. And you had a couple Reuters journalists in that video who were killed by the U.S. military. And then afterward, there's a father and his two children, and they drive up in a van. The father tried to rescue or help those who were wounded, and ended up being basically the target of a double tap strike. And by double tap, I mean that like there's an actual tactic in the U.S. military that they use when people are coming to rescue those who have been hit. That they bomb those people that are coming to rescue the targeted individuals. And so in that case, like what we're looking at here with Assange, and as you reflect on where we find ourselves, is basically that it's not going to be anything stunning if Donald Trump goes forward with the prosecution of somebody at the New York Times or the Washington Post, or let's say even CNN or CBS News for that matter. Although now they're captives, so maybe they won't be turning against Donald Trump after that merger. But uh, just to say that any individual who maybe thought that their general counsel of their media organization, which is their lawyer, could protect them just by getting the Justice Department to recognize that they would fight subpoenas, they would not comply with leak prosecutions. The Justice Department did away with these rules that were on the books that were intended to actually protect your confidential news gathering materials from being rifled through by FBI agents for the purposes of criminal investigation. So, we can parse this into two bits. Like, one, I'm saying that reporters now have less protections to stop the FBI from intruding into their news gathering to further their own criminal prosecutions. But now they also have less protection, I think, given the success of the Julian Assange prosecution, or the message that is sent by the Julian Assange prosecution to prevent the government or discourage the government from simply indicting them in order to silence their reporting. And so that's why, while I was covering this, and I think while you've been discussing it and others like us who understood the need for media solidarity, we had said, you all in any of these institutions that take journalism seriously need to make this a regular story that you're covering, because you could be the target at any moment. Sure, people like myself are probably more vulnerable than somebody at the New York Times. People who are on the streets right now documenting the LAPD and being arrested in the like around midnight after they've been shot with rubber bullets are probably more vulnerable to attacks by the press than even me. But that being said, I don't think there's anything to stop Donald Trump and his administration at this moment. It's fairly clear that anybody who wears a press jacket or has a press card is going to be a potential target of his administration.
Hey folks, Nolan Higdon here. Interrupting you real quick just to ask a favor. Can you please like, follow, comment, and subscribe to the podcast? It really helps get the show out to more people. If you also have a couple extra bucks in your pocket, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. You can go to patreon.com/Disinfo Detox, and you can become a paid subscriber for as little as $5 a month. It really helps get the show to more people, allows me to bring in more people and create more content. You can find a link to that in the show description. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, and let's just remind folks. I think a lot of folks, particularly on the left, I think they think that Julian Assange's crime was that he hacked the DNC emails or something like that. But that's not what he was accused of. Can you talk about what he was accused of? Because I think that also shed some light on the real motives behind his prosecution.
Well, yeah, so I was always careful to document, and so were his lawyers, the fact that he had exposed crimes committed by the United States government in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. One file, which I actually can claim a little bit of credit for exposing, involves how there was this attack on a compound in Iraq. In which there were people who were executed. There were innocent Iraqis who were, basically marched out. They were like, gagged and blindfolded, I think, and then they were actually bombed. And this was covered by a UN human rights commissioner. I believe his name was Philip Alston. and it was documented, and it was in this communications log that was released as part of like the 250,000 or more U.S. diplomatic cables that were disclosed by Chelsea Manning, the U.S. Army whistleblower who provided these materials to Assange and WikiLeaks. And this file, like, it just seemed like, your average report on some kind of atrocity. We'd read a lot of things of that nature related to the Iraq War, but I circulated it. It got picked up by Democracy Now! I remember Glenn Greenwald covered it. And then slowly it started to take on a life of its own. And it was noticed, it made its way back to the Iraqi government. And the Iraqi government recognized that they were in a moment with Barack Obama and his administration where they could dictate the terms of the status of forces agreement, which is how the Iraqi government was going to handle U.S. soldiers staying in Iraq. And they basically said, we're no longer going to grant immunity to the U.S. soldiers who have been deployed here. And that was a deal breaker for Barack Obama. And so he accelerated George W. Bush's plan to withdraw troops from the country. And that ultimately is what brought the Iraq war to an end. So you could say that Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning had a role in ultimately ending this invasion and occupation that was built on lies from the very beginning by the Bush administration. And that's just one example. I mean, if you go through the cables and you go through the Afghanistan and Iraq war logs, and even if you look at the Guantanamo files, these detainee assessment reports that were released on the nearly 800 people who were put, through different black site prisons by the CIA and then brought to Guantanamo, you can see the extent of the lies and the deception and the corrupt dealings of the U.S. government globally. The men who were there, you could see details about children that were rounded up and brought to Guantanamo. You could see before it had actually become a very public issue, you could see how the U.S. government was hiding drone strikes from the world. And, they had Yemen claim that they were responsible for the strikes so that the U.S. military didn't have to defend or justify what was being done. You could see things related to how they, at the State Department, act as sales people for Boeing to sell the jets. How the State Department isn't just out there doing diplomacy, but they'll go out and basically front for corporations and try to advance their businesses in different countries around the world, depress wages in Haiti, and fight all sorts of anti-corporate groups that were challenging businesses in the United States. And so there's torture that was detailed, there's war crimes, and then, at its core, you get to see the way in which diplomats from the United States government would go to great lengths in a very crooked manner to advance the agenda of the United States.
And that's why I love the title of your book. It's guilty of journalism. I mean, all those examples you just provided right there are the exact type of stories journalists should be procuring for the public. And so I think it's a great reminder of that, but it's also a great reminder of how whether it was a Democrat or Republican in office, they're willing to shed these principles if they have them of a free press because they thought this was a threat to their foreign policy agenda. And I think, it's a good lesson there. They're not principles if you break them at any time. And both these parties have let that principle lax, as has the public. I think the public didn't put enough pressure on those empowered to uphold that these principles as well. I know when I used to go out and just bring up the name Julian Assange, they're basically like hissing at me as he was this person who was hated by the right for supposedly undermining foreign policy and hated by the left for the supposed email leaks and all those kinds of things. But having reviewed that kind of history, and again with this idea of Assange kind of being somewhat of a canary in the coal mine, what do you make of today? I mean, you're a journalist in this environment. You're kind of looking at the environment where some of the most wealthy news outlets are bending the knee to the president. while these other, smaller media outlets are doing what they can to fight back, but they're also, struggling to stay alive. So I wonder, as a journalist, what do you kind of make? What's the vibe amongst folks in your industry, and what are you thinking as a journalist about what you see here in the United States right now?
Well, to me, it's probably one of the most isolating and bleak moments that I've felt as a journalist. I do feel more of a responsibility than ever to keep the newsletter going and doing this work on press freedom and whistleblowing and government secrecy. I think one of the struggles as a journalist is just how difficult it is to keep this going and convince people to support the work that you want to do. And I'm not here to use your show to ask for money, but just to make the point that, like, I believe there are a lot of really good journalists out there that are walking away from doing the work, and those are the people that I actually wish would stick around, because I think that they have ethics and their hearts in the right place, and they really do believe in the power of the profession to tell these stories like the ones that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks exposed that I was talking about previously. I live in a West Chicago suburb, and I have in the last couple of months started a community newsletter here because we have a local news desert in our Chicago suburb, and the Chicago Tribune bought up like a whole network of suburban newspapers at one point, and there's really no reporters. So as far as like local city politics, I think that there's a lot of people right now that, even as your show deals in national and international stories primarily, I think there are a lot of little battles happening in cities across America, and journalists who are expected or should be covering them are at an incredible disadvantage, because those stories they're never going to break through over something that's happening at a state level or a national level. And I also think that, like, people have mostly tuned out what's happening locally, which is disappointing. But I understand it. I recognize it, because it's something that, like, there's a couple professors or scholars, John Nichols and Robert McChesney, who had wrote about the collapse of journalism, and and McChesney, rest in power, because we lost him this year, but he was an incredible media analyst and understood the way that the system worked, to a degree that he was raising the alarm about losing thousands upon thousands of newspapers. And now, with all the rampant media consolidation, I do think that independent journalists like us, who maybe thought we could like get a leg up before because that media consolidation meant that these organizations weren't covering the stories that need to be covered. But I also don't know if that's necessarily really true anymore, because I see a lot of these so-called corporate media outlets, or even just legacy media outlets, are covering what I used to cover, and that competition is really difficult for a publication like Black, because the algorithms online through Google, different spaces, you know, you know, and the lack of resources, it just basically means that I can write about this and continue to share my perspective. And I think there's a lot of credibility that I have that those other organizations lack. But that doesn't necessarily guarantee you the subscribers, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee you the eyeballs and the traction for your work. So I guess, in a very like roundabout way, I'm hinting at something here where it feels like more than ever, those of us who can need to try and give platforms and promote the people who have been doing this, like yourself, like Project Censored. There's a Movement Media Alliance that I'm
Mhm.
really a big fan of their work in this moment, and pay attention to those grassroots journalists out there, and others who are doing the work, and not coming to it suddenly because it makes sense politically. Because I think, like, you look at the more prestige media organizations, or you look at these legacy journalists, and as they do cover important stories about the Trump administration related to the media, related to what's happening with news, the Paramount Skydance merger, capitulation, the FCC's war on the press that is being waged, they definitely should be covering it. And I don't want them to not. And I'm not saying that the stuff that they put out there shouldn't be read and consumed. I want them to do this kind of stories, but I also think try to remember who was doing this work when Biden was in office. Try to remember who was doing the work when Trump was first in office and took his threat seriously and didn't say like, oh, it'll be okay. We'll be able to weather the storm. And also remember the people who took Obama seriously and didn't just give him a chance because like hope and change could come to all of us if we just patiently waited, but said immediately you're taking these actions that are attacks on civil liberties. You're continuing the infrastructure of the war on terrorism, and this is going to set us back tremendously as a country. Because I do think that I've lived through a chapter in American history where it's very clear that there's been a progression and everything is built on top of itself since George W. Bush was elected in 2000. At least that's how I feel. And then I know there are other people who are older will trace it back to Ronald Reagan, and every generation has a different perspective on how they view the history. But it just does feel like in my work as a journalist, the context that should be brought to recognizing this moment is to not just say, well, Trump is undertaking these attacks on the press now, but to also recognize that there's a whole lot that has led up to this point where journalists and the press in general just don't have the capacity to defend themselves and protect the First Amendment the way that they should be able to. I mean, when you see rising fascism, it would be so much better if the press was a little bit healthier and could actually confront what we see unfolding. But I don't think they're weak just because of things that Donald Trump has done over the past 6 months, though there's certainly been a weakening. I mean, the shutdown of PBS, the funding mechanism of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting will have an impact on a lot of various radio stations that people had depended on for information and news. But I mean, we got to go before that. And I think you know that as well, that there's just so much in the chain of events that has been widely documented. And the fact that it went so overlooked, it went so disregarded by people who would step forward and claim awards in journalism, who would step forward and claim awards for press freedom. I mean, it's on them. And I don't think it's wrong to say that those people have to take more responsibility, because just to bring it back to where we began, there was a media silence up until a few weeks ago about journalists who were starving and dying in Gaza. And then suddenly there was a picture printed, I believe it was by the New York Post, of that baby. And then just after that, you saw journalists are dying in Gaza made it immediately into the headlines. And you saw these news wires like the Agence France Presse and Associated Press, and then the BBC finally speaking out for the stringers that they had on the ground who are doing this at great risk to their health and their well-being. And so I impress upon you and your listeners and everyone watching that, to take the additional steps to go find those people who have been diligent and active, and not just lazily scroll through your phone and read what Apple News gives you on a given night.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, and I'm glad you also reiterated that point about the bipartisan problem. 'Cause so much of our news narratives are hyper partisan, right? So if it's Trump did it, they tell the Democrats it must be bad. Republicans defend it. But to your point, this has been both parties, and it's been decades in the making. And I'm sure this happens to you, but no matter who's in office, I'm always critiquing them. And without fail, if you start critiquing Trump now that he's in office, you get the MAGA people who say, "What about Biden?" And I'm like, "Well, I was writing about this during Biden and Obama."
Well, if I could just cut in quickly, I feel that I fare better as a journalist when a Democrat's in the White House. I think that what I write about and cover, I generate a bigger audience. I feel like I'm doing better. There's something about when the Republican is in office. And I also know that I was an intern at The Nation magazine. This is what they had kind of, well, actually, they had an opposite thing of like Obama. People stopped subscribing and sort of tuned out. And that's the reason why publications that are alternative publications like mine do better, because some of the magazines and other spaces that you'd expect funding to still continue, it's like it dries up because they don't think that those Democrats are going to pose any kind of a threat. And I think it becomes harder to articulate it, because we have this two-party system that doesn't create any kind of an alternative. There's nowhere for people to go. So that feeling of being trapped, it's like they don't want to just constantly be feeding negative information about a Democratic president when you're not going to go tell people to vote for the Republican as an alternative. So I do think that, like, yeah, that leads to this politicization of our news media, and how there is this tribalism, and how so much of what you put out as a journalist is expected to acknowledge or grapple with certain political realities. But I've never felt like I can't publish less of what the reality is when it comes to freedom of the press, or attacks on whistleblowers, or the ultra secrecy on the part of government agencies, simply because somebody's going to lose an election in the next 2 or 4 years, and we're going to be set back as a country. I mean, I think you have a responsibility, no matter who is in office, to be relentless about the coverage that you push out with your newsletter, your publication, the channel that you have on YouTube, however you're putting out your news.
Yeah, and just to wrap up here, I know you said you didn't come on the show to ask for money, but I'm going to tell folks they should spend money if they can, support you if they can anyway. If they don't have cash, I'm sure some shares, likes, all those kinds of things help out. We, as long as we live in a capitalist society, journalists need to eat, and democracy needs a free press. So can you tell folks where they can follow your work and find you?
Yeah, if you go to thedissenter.org, that's where you can subscribe to the Dissenter newsletter. I do a podcast too every couple of weeks, just digging into the core issues that are covered by the publication. And so that's where people can go if they'd like to support this work.
Absolutely. Kevin Gosztola, thank you so much for coming on the Disinfo Detox.
Thank you.
Hey Detoxers, this is the Disinfo Detox. If you believe in media literacy for all, help us keep going, become a paid subscriber at patreon.com/disinfodetox. There's also plenty of free ways to support. You can like, comment, follow, or share. Every little bit helps. Thanks for supporting the Disinfo Detox, where media literacy meets breaking news.